Who knows this person?
Who doesn't
Who,
know
all
this
right, how about
person?
who does not know this person? Okay. Okay, cool. This is Elizabeth Holmes, and she was catapulted into sort of tech startup fame. A couple of years ago, she founded a company called Theranos, and it was a novel company that could, with one drop of blood, detect any type of abnormalities that one might have, disease states, and things like that. So she created this box called the Edison, where the blood would be sort of dissected and analyzed. What it was supposed to do was help to reduce people's fear of having to give a ton of blood to run labs. So it sounds really, really awesome, except for the fact that the entire thing was a fraud. Um, so Maybe about a year ago, Theranos was completely shut down, but before it was, Elizabeth and her management team raised hundreds of millions of dollars, and their company was valued at $9 billion. And she was like named the richest self-made woman in the world, and all of these accolades. So what went wrong, and why are we even talking about her? So what went wrong was that she created something that was actually not regulated by the FDA. She submitted false reports numerous times on numerous occasions and basically falsified her entire company. And so we want to talk to you today about there's sort of this anxiety we sort of see with budding entrepreneurs about the FDA and about regulatory, because it sounds really scary, right? Like our whole company was shut down, and makes entrepreneurs feel like maybe I shouldn't engage with the FDA at all. I don't want that happening to me. I don't plan on doing anything fraudulent, but I still feel anxious about the FDA. So I think the purpose of today's talk is to talk about what the FDA actually does, what it stands for, and how entrepreneurs, even with ideas, should be talking to the FDA as soon as possible, and what you can actually do to engage with them so that you don't end up like Elizabeth. So we'll talk about my story with AbiliLife, engaging with the FDA, and then just sort of like our roadmap of how we got to where we are, and then some conclusions. So my story is a winding one. It started in 1989 when I was around 2. That was my mom, and that was when she was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which is a neuromuscular disease. We wouldn't know at the time, but she lived for 25 years with the disease. Um, it's severely impacted her movement as the disease progressed. But it was all I knew, having a mom with this disease. So I was really passionate about education, so I went to Spelman College in 2005 studying psychology, and left with the intention of becoming a business school professor. So got a PhD from Carnegie Mellon and started in 2009. I was at Tepper, but not the fancy Tepper, like the older Tepper. um, but the degree still works. Yeah, I just thought that I would be a business school professor, and realized that my mom's disease is progressing more and more. And what was happening with her was that her posture was slumped over. So she was like kind of hunched over. And I don't know if you've seen like older people and they kind of get in that position. You just don't think anything of it. But what happens is that it increases their likelihood of falls. It reduces their quality of life because they're just in this very uncomfortable position. So I went to Alpha Lab. No, I went to Carnegie Mellon's incubator, so Project Olympus, and they referred me to the biomedical engineering group here. Back in 2013, I said, listen, I have to create something for my mom. I don't know what it is, but there's nothing on the market to help her just improve her posture. So fast forward about a year after that, got into Alpha Lab gear with this prototype, which I think is in the next slide, but it's a back brace to lift your shoulders up and back and give you support. So I did that in 2014, and then that's when I realized, like, okay, I'm building a medical device. And what does that mean? And what do I need from a regulatory standpoint and then from like a reimbursement standpoint? So it was around, I want to say around 2014, 2015, when I met Dr. Gupta. through her daughter, who was at the time a CMU student and wanted to intern with me because she just liked what we were doing. And it was at that time that I was introduced to the FDA and what it is, what it stands for, and why it was so important to my career as an entrepreneur. So kind of fast forward, got a grant from the National Science Foundation, got the brace covered by Medicare, and then spent some considerable time working with Dr. Gupta with the FDA to understand another product that we were interested in developing, which is a clinical wearable tool, which needed more regulation than the back brace that we had, but basically to track motor symptoms for patients. So spent some time with pre-submission meetings. And then you can see in 2017, 2018, or 19, we had some really great traction with actually having Aetna, Blue Cross, Humana, Cigna, actually reimbursing the brace that we have on the market today. So this is what the brace looks like. So it's made of like soft material, and there's a pulley tensioning system right here in the back that lifts, like physically lifts your shoulders up and back. So our intended use or indication for use, it's a back brace designed specifically for geriatric and neuromuscular patients. So Parkinson's disease, spinal stenosis, and osteoporosis. So it rolls the shoulders up and back for a more natural and healthy posture. And there's a rigid back panel support from the tailbone to the top of the shoulder blades. So this is considered a Class 1 exempt. So we'll talk a little bit about the different sort of classifications, but when you go to the FDA, it's not everything is created equal. So for this is like the lowest risk that you could get. So this is essentially every year registration. It's under a regulation, and there's a specific description and a specific code for this particular brace. So one of the things that you'll learn with the FDA and then with CMS or Medicare is that everything is kind of codified and everything has a place. So that's important to note. So where we started, sort of the post-marketing to today was this was originally designed for Parkinson's patients. But now, through our Medicare code that we received, there's about 600 pre-existing diagnosis codes that we can use the brace for. So osteoporosis, spinal stenosis, kyphosis, those are some of our most popular ones. Before, only CMS reimbursed for the brace, and now we have about 20 commercial insurances that consider us like the sole provider for this particular product. So it's interesting to sort of see the growth and the change, but one thing that I think this slide should mention is that it's incremental change, and so you have to be mindful and to continue to push forward and move forward, because every single little bit that you can get and grow will help your company. So I think so. Is this your slide now?
It's yours. That's the one that interconnected spine.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a lot that goes into an FDA strategy, one of which is like investors, grants, personal experiences and testimonies. You have novel technology, patent claims, payer reimbursement, pricing. So there's all of these types of sort of entities and things that you have to be mindful of, and it can seem overwhelming, particularly as you're building sort of a med tech company. But it's important to note that each and every one of these will help you in your FDA strategy. So we reported on and spoken about every single one of these because it matters. So that's the one thing that I thought was very cool about the FDA, was that they are interested in knowing, like, well, who are your investors? And, you know, are they aligned with FDA strategies? Like, you know, if you have any grants, what did you use the money for to sort of progress forward? They are interested. They do have sort of like a dual pricing pathway where they'll work with CMS and they'll also work with like commercial insurances to sort of make sure that there's alignment. So they are very keen and interested in learning about this web. Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay, so that's a very nice preview from Courtney. So a little bit about myself. I've spent about 20 years working in the pharmaceutical industry. I was at Bristol Myers Squibb for 15 years. And then I moved to a Japanese company called Otsuka that also developed medical devices. And Otsuka launched the first digital pill. So it was a pill with a sensor embedded in it. And so that was my introduction to devices. And then I have two kids, one who graduated from CMU and works in a medical device company in Silicon Valley. So we're all very medical device focused. And my son is a student here. But as I engaged with the entrepreneurial community here, and I saw this, this first interaction was really with Courtney, and I've since engaged with many startups, CMU or kit-based. What I felt that with FDA, it's not only that something that you need to engage with, but also FDA plays a very valuable role as a partner, especially if you're a startup, because you need that partnership. You need somebody else who's thinking along with you for that optimal product. So what I wanted to do in the next few slides is generic FDA stuff. It's kind of boring. I tried to make it as interesting as possible, and also kind of in terms of what I have experienced over the past few years working with entrepreneurs. And then Courtney will come back and then go into really how we engaged with FDA for her product. All right, so we come back once more to Theranos, and in case you haven't, not aware of her, but I think there are many sources, and if you haven't read Bad Blood, I would strongly encourage, because it really shows, it almost is like she did not start out to say that I'm going to dupe the FDA and I'm going to fraud, but it was some circumstances. And this is a slippery slope. It can really snowball super fast. So that book was excellent. There is ABC 2020 report, and then of course there's the HBO documentary on Elizabeth, and these all came out like late 2018 and 2019. But what I wanted to do was at a high level kind of show you what were the findings from FDA audit. So her company was inspected by FDA, by CMS, then Department of Justice and the SEC, so everybody got very engaged. So the FDA inspected Theranos 3 times, and they had serious warning letters. So this was, again, a very high, and if you go to the FDA website and just type Theranos, you'll get everything. So the first warning letter was in 2015, and this was, again, when FDA comes and does audits and there's serious findings, it doesn't go to the person who was working with the FDA in the lab. No, it always goes, even for big companies, even for BMS. If there was a serious finding, it was addressed to the CEO. So the expectation for the FDA is when you're running a medical device company, it's serious. Because you're dealing with people with serious illnesses, and regardless of who you are and how big the company is, you need to know about your product. So in this case, it was addressed to Elizabeth Holmes. And if you see some of the high-level findings, and these are serious findings, right? And again, I would say that what's posted is not an exhaustive list. The exhaustive list could be pages and pages. So the most serious findings were listed, some of them redacted. But it says, and some of the findings that the FDA has were, first of all, you did not do design validation to conform to user needs, design validation under actual or simulated use condition, what are the design input requirements, design analysis, document review and approval. So if you are in a prototype stage, these are some of the basic things you need to do when you're developing a medical device. Clearly, the FDA found serious gaps in all of these, so they raised this as gaps. So clearly, as Courtney said, it was a fraud. She did not have any of these results that she was touting to get the grants. So there's one thing about research, right? FDA is all about science. It's grounded in science. So that was the scientific aspect of it. When the FDA inspected, they had 2 sites. And the way the FDA went was they landed simultaneously in both the sites, right? And FDA comes unannounced. So they really want to see in real-time FDA, real-time, day-to-day, how are you performing. So that was the technical aspects. This is where they went to, I think, the Newark site, where they did more of the manufacturing. So this was addressed to Ramesh Balwani, Sunny Balwani, who was the COO. Here you see there are some of more of what we say the quality aspects. So for the FDA, it's not about just the science, but the quality. How are you generating that data? It has to be absolutely top-notch, per FDA standards for them to accept it. Why? Because you're using that data to give advice to very sick people, morbidity, mortality, right? So you need to meet quality, and I'll come to that in a bit. But if you see what they said, so they had already had products in the market. Device listing, Courtney, as you said, registration and listing is a must. If you need to sell a medical device, even if it's exempt, you gotta list your company and your product at the FDA's website, so it's in their radar. They didn't do that. When you're out in the market, you have to look at how you receive, review, evaluate patient complaints. Didn't do that. They did not meet product specs. I mean, they didn't have any specs. They were super loose. They did not have any CAPAs, corrective and preventive actions. Of course, you cannot have the perfect device, but monitoring what's happening post-marketing and you're taking those corrective preventive actions, that's what FDA wants to see. Didn't have that. They didn't have any validation of their software, suppliers. That's the other thing, right? When you're going to third party, right, and you're building your device, and the third party is the one who's not up to snuff with their standards, you just can't say, oh, well, they didn't do a good job. No, it's your product. You are responsible for ensuring that that third-party supplier is meeting those standards. So you see the accountability that the FDA expects. They didn't have that. Then they didn't have records and didn't have quality audits, etc. And again, the FDA will say, this is not an exhaustive list of findings, which is not public, but it's like, I can imagine like a big dossier. And then they had another warning letter in 2016 because they were using this device in patients, and because this was investigated, they should have done, have an IRB, consent forms. They had none of that. So they got another warning letter as well. So I wanted to point out, so you've all known the SEC, the DOJ got charges, but here, this was alleged wire fraud schemes. But see, this is from FDA also. So it really goes, again, this is an extreme example, but it highlights to you how serious this is and how important it is that you engage with the FDA appropriately. It's not just engaging, but what I wanted to bring home to you, and then Courtney will present in her section, is how really can you build that partnership with the FDA. And so both Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny both were found to have conducted fraud. Okay, so FDA, in a nutshell, so if you go to the webpage, the food and drug, but it's really not just food and drug, but they regulate a number of products, right? From food, drug, devices, radiation, vaccines, so on and so forth. But at a high level, they regulate about 1 trillion worth of products, so a lot of medical products. One of the primary mission is to protect and promote U.S. health. They are held responsible in this country to protect U.S. citizens. That's a very serious responsibility. But the important thing is FDA, often I've heard, oh, FDA is like the IRS. No, that's very different. FDA is grounded on science and technology and how to encourage the evolving technology to treat U.S. patients, U.S. citizens. So FDA is about modernization. How can you streamline? How can you expedite? They incentivize. And you come to a development pathway that's least burdensome. This is an FDA term. What is least burdensome? Most efficient manner and at the right time. So it's all about doing the right studies at the right time with the right design. So if you get that right data, it has to be successful, that you can get your product in necessary studies. So the main important part is, and especially when you are a startup, is to leverage this whole FDA modernization approach by early engagement and partnership with the FDA. So how do you do that? So then what's a medical product? So FDA has the definitions for everything, right? So it is for disease, and it is to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease or a medical condition. It can affect the structure or function of a body, and for drugs, it undergoes, also in addition, undergoes chemical action within the body. But more recently, there are many softwares that are being developed that are standalone medical devices, and I think many of you might be working on them, and they're called SAMDs. And for software as a medical device, and FDA works with the international community to standardize their definition. It's about diagnosing, treating, driving clinical management, or informing clinical management. So when you look at this, this is not the same as general fitness, a band that can help you track your steps or how well you slept, or also any kind of software as a service to like order a ride or your food, things like that. Very different. And oftentimes in my engagement with the startups, I often see that sometimes they seem to bucket it the same way, and they're not to be done the same way. So there are big differences, and it is really important that you understand that. And here is the reason why, right? You cannot compare the seriousness of this versus this. So now that you know what the FDA does, high level, what's a medical product? So how do you market a medical product? So the basic requirement for FDA, whether drug, device, biologic, combination product, whatever, you have to show RAISE, a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. And then again, reasonable, right? That's very kind of qualitative, and that is why you need to have that regulatory strategy to figure out what's reasonable. And really what the FDA looks like at the end of the day for your product, it will have benefit, but it will always have risk. It's hard to say that there's a product with zero risk. But at the end of the day, your benefit has to exceed your risk. And to look at those three main qualities, the efficacy, the safety, and then the quality that we were talking about, how you do the studies, how you manage your product. And it's all about evidence. So it's the evidentiary and manufacturing standards. And then if you have risk, how are you managing your risk? All of that goes into product label. This is by far the most important thing. This is your identity for your product. Your product label, and we'll touch upon that in a bit. That leads to marketing authorization. But then, post-marketing, you start your surveillance, where you're looking at your manufacturing, your scale-up, safety, what is the real world use. You might be looking at new research, new opportunities. That leads to your product label update. That leads to your product optimization. So as I've seen, so medical product, I mean, it's really, really tough. I mean, between all of the competition and the pivot, budget, resources, funding, so on and so forth, and then understanding the regs that are constantly evolving, information overload, there's an unclear pathway. So yes, I agree. It is really challenging. So as I have worked with the startups, I felt like, what might be a starting point, and how can we leverage what you do already as a startup? And so when you start your business, think whether you're a pro project or your NSF I-Corps, what you start off is your business concept, right? And in your concept, you will have what the prototype is, what your technology is. You will always have some idea as to what its use might be or what might be its claims. And then also definitely look at your competitive strategy, right? And when you're looking at competitive strategy, you might say, there's already something in the market. I want to come up with something similar, but maybe just incremental changes. So, i.e., you already have something called a predicate that the FDA says. Or you might say, I know there is something in the market, but I want mine to be substantially different so I can differentiate. Or you could say that mine is so unique, there is nothing in the market, and you're a trailblazer. And so that's your business concept, but really your business concept leads to what are the main elements of an FDA strategy. Labeling, what would be your reg pathway, what might be your development and your quality optimization, and then what might be your marketing strategy. So as I said, labeling is like your fundamental starting point. So it is really the primary source of legal information that you can talk about your product to anybody, whether it's your patient, whether it's a caregiver, it's a physician, to investors, in the public, in the web, social media, wherever. And if you look at a device label, these are the main sections normally a label will have. And it could be a multi-page document, but the main parts are two things: the intended use, that is what's the overall purpose of the device. And the other one is indication for use. So I can give you an example. It could be an intended use is this is a hearing aid. An indication for use could be this is a hearing aid for mild to moderate patients that can have automatic fitting and self-selection, and it can be used also to connect to your, I'm just making this up, right? So you see how you expand on it. So a general use, and then you have your indication for use. But this is where all your differentiation strategy really gets embedded. And then the rest of it really is from when you do the work, what is your result? It's the benefit and the risk, right? The contraindication, warning, precautions, how the instructions for use for the physician or the patient, your device description, your specs, your safety, and your effectiveness. Right. So when you come to then regulatory pathway, it is really determined by your proposed labeling. And then, of course, what the risk is and if there is an existing predicate or not. So if you're doing a pure medical product or an accessory, so you have to go either through, you have to register and list your product. To go to class 1 exempt, that Courtney has a product. You can do a class 2 if it's a predicate. Remember, if your strategy is, I'm going to be similar to something in the market, but just incremental changes, and that's where I just want to start out, 510K. But if you say I have a low to moderate risk, but there is no predicate, I'm a trailblazer, then a 510K does not apply. You have to go through a de novo, and through a de novo pathway, you could be a class 1 or a class 2. If you're a high-risk, life-sustaining product, an artificial lung, okay, your patient is, your life, the mortality of your patient is dependent, that's a class 3. You also can go through, if you're doing for a rare disease, that it affects less than 8,000 patients or less in the US, then you can get something called HT, a humanitarian device exemptions. But what I have seen is that for startups, not everybody says, my end product is going to be a medical device. Some come up with tools to develop a medical product, right? And they are saying, my initial business strategy is going to have this tool that other medical product developers can use to develop their product, and I can use my own tool for myself. But then how are you going to convince this other party to come and say, I'm going to trust your tool? Well, there are ways you can get kind of recognized by the FDA, classified by the FDA, or designated by the FDA. They look at only as a tool, and there are several ways that you can do that too. So it really is dependent on your business strategy. And remember that labeling. What is it? I'm a tool to develop a medical device, or I'm a medical device. So a little bit on how it builds from labeling the risk to the red pathway. So the low risk, as I said, class 1 exempt, that Courtney first brace has, about 47% of current medical devices have that pathway. The majority of them are exempt, and few of surgical apparel, that's a class 1 exempt. But then there was a company that developed a wrap for restless leg syndrome. It's a wrap, but since there was nothing in the market, they had to go through a de novo pathway, but they're still a class 1. So again, it's very dependent on what you claim. For class 2, about 43%, again, 510K or exempt or de novo. And here I wanted to give an example of hearing aids. So hearing aids are many kinds. So you can go for the very basic air conduction hearing aids that you've seen. Those are 510K, but they're exempt. But then there's a hearing aid that goes through bone conduction. That's a little more higher risk. You have to file a 510K. And then recently, Bose had a hearing aid that got approved that you can use a software and your phone actually controls your hearing aid. That's super novel. Nothing exists. That's de novo. Software as a medical device, right? An app for addiction therapy that got approved by Pear Therapeutics. That was de novo. So you see, depending on the risk, so if you want to do something that's completely nothing in the market, trailblazer, de novo. If you're doing something that's similar in the market, you're just making incremental changes, 510K. And of course, high-risk pacemaker or artificial lung, then you're a PMA. So I wanted to make a case that also for having worked with several CMU and tech startups, de novo pathway is really the one that's trending because the technology that you are using is so disruptive and different. Indications are so innovative and novel that I definitely see that this is a pathway that majority of the startups I work with have to have that pathway, and also looked at some of the data source from FDA. And if you see for over the past 8 years or so, there's been a sharp uptick in de novo, and that's because this is the pathway. If you have, you're a trailblazer, it's a novel device, novel technology, novel indication. It has very unique type of patient-focused type of labeling. You'll be the first to market. There is nothing else like this in the market, and you can have built-in strategies to delay competition. And so, at a very high level, so the FDA approval is all based on evidence, right? The benefit and the risk. You have to apply the least burdensome principles. And the important part is you have to align with the FDA. No matter, there could be ANSI or AME or IEEE standards, whatever it is, you still really need to align with the FDA on what you are planning to do. If you think you know better, you're going to do all the studies and then show up and they'll say, okay, good, you're approved. Very rarely does that ever work. So it's really about the what and the how. So what you need to do high level for a device is bench testing, non-clinical, and clinical testing. Then you come out with controls, right? This is like a very, very high level descriptor. But it's the how you do it. It's about the quality. It has to be generated in a manner that's of the absolutely highest standards that the FDA expects you to do. So when you quality, you look at the good manufacturing practices or the lab or clinical. And what the company says, the culture of excellence. So if you recall, those warning letters were sent to the CEO or COO. What they are saying that within your device company, you have to have that culture of integrity, of always performing to the highest standards. And things are not easy so that you're not faking it or somehow compromising the results. And then, of course, there are opportunities you can expedite. You can cut down on your development time. You can cut down on FDA review times. And there are many novel approaches by which you can make your studies shorter. They can run faster without compromising the standards that the FDA asks for, like you have the early feasibility studies, adaptive designs. You can use real-world evidence. A lot of focus on patient preference, a lot. And it's increasing more and more where they want patient-reported outcome. They want patients to be involved in your study design. So include in your labeling things that patients would want, not just what the physician wants or what just your market research is telling you. So I wanted to touch on, so why is labeling important? Like I said, that is your identity of your product. But here is an FDA quote. It says, most, if not all, advertising is labeling. And here I took an example of advertising. It was on Pinterest. I just said medical device. I said, here you go. These are all labeling for different medical devices. They have to be aligned with your label. So whatever you say in your label, that needs to be reflected in your advertising, and it could be on TV, on print, on social media. If you're on a booth in a conference, if you're presenting to an investor, whatever. So it becomes really, really important that you get the right label. And the other thing I wanted to also say is that once you have the drug approved and in the market, that here's the FDA quote, is that you are expected to monitor the adverse events, but FDA does it too. The FDA is not just sitting back and kind of waiting for you to come to them. They do a lot of proactive monitoring and more so. And this was actually a slide from the FDA. Recently, they had an advisory committee on breast implants, and there's been so many adverse reports on the safety of breast implants. And so they had an advisory committee to say whether they should keep it in the market or not. And here is a summary from the FDA. They said they did a survey of reports for the last 10 years. And they looked at all of these saline or silicone-filled breast implants, and they had kind of this slide which they said all of the AEs that was reported by the patient. So the FDA is monitoring it, and they are going to make sure that whether they should keep the product in the market or remove it. So the marketing strategy is really, once you put the product in the market, it's really the beginning of the life of your product. And so what the FDA is seeing is that first is, are you showing responsibility as a company, or also it is the gateway for product enhancement such that, so first of all, your advertising and promotion, that has to be in compliance. Your safety and surveillance, whether they're adverse events or device malfunction, or if you're making manufacturing changes. And that's where FDA monitors and you get a warning for non-compliance. But as you're there in the market, and as Courtney will say, you find other opportunities based on how patients are taking it up or patient feedback, that you can look at new indication, new populations, new other products. So that also helps you for your product enhancement. So this, at a high level, is what the FDA requires you to do a medical, for your development of your product. So how should you engage with them? And so the important part of the FDA, first of all, there are no fees. And I can tell you that having worked with several health authorities across the globe, there are very few agencies that meet with you and give you as much time for free as the FDA. Now you could say, okay, taxpayer money. Yes, we do support that, so do the other health authorities across the globe. So up until now, I have a feeling a couple years down the line, we might need to pay. And also, the FDA is in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is about 3.5 hours drive from here. So face-to-face meeting is very doable. And so the important part is that, as you've seen, the desired labeling, what studies you need to do to support that labeling is so important to align with them early before you start big studies, and you've done those studies already, so you don't have to go back and repeat them. Also, when you go to the FDA, as you have that discussion, they can give you ideas which helps you come back and think whether there are other differentiation strategies, different other options, and helps you in your decision making. It is really critical for successful funding. I'm an NSF reviewer, and when I review medical devices, and if I see there's no FDA engagement, or I see when they come up and they say, we are coming up with the most disruptive technology, and they say, regulatory pathway, 510K. Can you tell me right now that doesn't work? Clearly, they haven't done their homework at all. That does not work. So, for different agencies now, as reviewers, they are engaging more people like myself who have experience working with the FDA to do a grant review. So that becomes important. It's important for VCs as well, especially after the Theranos debacle, that they want to make sure, if you're in the medical device area, that you are working with the FDA, and it really adds to your exit strategy and company valuation. So some of the things that I wanted to caution. So one of the things that people get confused, startups, is that FDA is like a consultant. You go with them and say, here is all of my data, and kind of tell me what to do. That's not the case. The FDA is not a consultant. FDA is there where you've looked at your data, looked at the available guidances, and you've analyzed it, and you say, here is my proposal. Do you agree with it or not? And so it is really important that you're up to date on what the current reg intel, whether it's new guidance, new products that are being approved, FDA white papers. There's a ton of information that gets put out on the FDA website on a daily basis. Poor briefing document, a dump of information, not well developed, you will get unanticipated FDA questions. The feedback is suboptimal. But the worst part is that all of these get captured in formal meeting minutes. You talk to the FDA, there are meeting minutes, and they will live forever in the FDA database. So you want to make sure that when you're going in there, though, that you are well prepared. And so the important part, all I will say, this is not a DIY activity if you are a startup. I would strongly recommend that if you're in this community, between PEG, between CMU, there are advisors, but then as you engage long-term with somebody who has that experience and can guide you to have that right meeting, the most effective meeting with the agency. I'm not going to go over all of these sub-bullets. The slides will be posted, but really what is important as you prepare in order to build the right partnership and be well prepared is to have the right timing, not too early where it's just a concept of paper, or not too late when you've done all of your studies, but somewhere in between. You have to have the right content. So FDA has like guidances, like the Q-submission program, but they're quite detailed as to what your briefing document should look like. You have to have the right conduct when you're in the meeting, because you're in the lead, but in a collaborative manner. And so if you have somebody who's worked with the FDA before, that's a great help to facilitate that meeting along. And it's not that you always have to agree with them. There can be counterpoint. If you don't agree, or if you feel that the FDA didn't quite understand what you were trying to say, absolutely, it's a science-based discussion. So again, it has to be grounded in science, data, regs, but by all means, give counterpoints. And then the right people. FDA is looking for technical expertise, not marketing people, at the end of the day. So you need the right FDA liaison, the technical therapeutic expertise, but also when you go, you want the right people from FDA to come as well. And you need to prepare for that in advance, so you have the right people across both sides. All right, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Courtney.
Okay. So this is just sort of basically talking about, we talked about labeling and why labeling is so important. So what you want to have as your label, meaning like what FDA will approve your device to be used for, matters in terms of like your budget and your cost. So like how much of a study do you need to create in order to get alert for high fall risk? So for my wearable, if I want to just alert someone and say, hey, your posture is compromised, that's not as much money as something like preventing falls, right? Like that's a really big undertaking and a really big study that includes a lot of like monitoring. So when you're thinking about your startup, it might be tempting to sort of tell investors, hey, we're going to prevent falls, because that sounds really exciting. But the reality of the situation is you'll probably need like hundreds of millions of dollars to actually invest in just getting the product to market. And so you just have to understand, it's not that you can't do it, but just understand that like the pathway that you're going on. So we've had continuous engagement with the FDA since 2016. So you can see here, we started in 2016 and did a pre-submission meeting, which is what one of the things Elora was talking about. And we had actual questions, pulled together documentation, gave it to them ahead of time, and then they came back with their responses, and then we had questions based on their responses and answers based on their responses. So we did that for the full portfolio, just letting them know like our entire strategy in 2016, 2017. We started talking about like the software program for the wearable. And then 2018, most recently, we talked actually with the with CMS during a parallel sort of feedback session. So again, like Elora was saying, it's really very valuable. You only get 60 minutes, but it's a very valuable 60 minutes. I think that's also good leverage for potential investors to sort of say we have a very clear regulatory pathway, so they know that you're not just winging it, and that they'll invest money in you, and then come to find out you need a ton more money to even get going with what you're doing. So I think for me, that's been a way to stand out against competition that has not even engaged the FDA at all. So This is sort of my post-marketing experience that I found with the brace. I found that I can extend the brace to not just Parkinson's disease, but neuromuscular diseases. Also, some people who have low back pain and issues with that have found that the brace sort of compresses the area, so it just helps them to alleviate some of that low back pain. And this is all from just sort of case studies that patients have been talking to us just as we attend different conferences and meeting with different patients. So the real world experience is also very important. That's why I think it's been helpful to have a Class 1 exempt device on the market, because we can actually get real feedback from patients and caregivers. So in 2018, actually I think like to the day, actually tomorrow, last year on April 3rd, we received our patent. It was granted for the brace, so our claims were basically, if anyone knows about patent law, it's basically like you're explaining what your invention is, sort of line by line. So we submitted, I think it was like 21 claims, and they all came back novel. So one of our sort of strategies is to embed and take some of those claims and potentially put them into FDA indications for use along the later at a later stage. So that's another way to protect your sort of property, your company, is that if you can take some of the patented claims that you either have submitted or have been granted to you and work that somehow into your indication for use, then that prevents other companies from coming behind you and doing exactly what you're doing, but maybe they are better at execution or whatnot, and you just kind of want to box the competition out. So it goes back to that previous slide that I had about just all the various types of, investors, grants, things that you wouldn't think about when you think about the FDA, but all of it matters. So this is just sort of an example of what we showed the FDA when we talked about the wearable. So we have on this far left the brace that's already marketed, but then just sort of a mock-up of like how the smart brace would actually be interacting. So the arrows indicate data. So there are sensors that are on the brace that the data sort of go into this machine learning algorithm in this cloud platform. So we're then able to look at, sort of aggregate the data and use machine learning algorithms to determine whether a patient is in a compromised posture, whether their gait patterns have changed, things that might indicate that a patient is at a higher fall risk than maybe minutes before. So you're collecting, aggregating, and storing that data, and then it's being pushed out to, a wearable device or even to like a web portal. So this is just a great way of showing how sometimes, even if you don't have the invention created, how you should be visualizing and showing what's actually happening, because it's easier to sort of point to a diagram in these FDA meetings. So, yeah, I mean, I think maybe just a couple of concluding points. I think the biggest thing that I think should hit home is that you're never too early to start with the FDA, so long as you're thoughtful about what it is that you're interested in talking to them about and pulling together a substantial sort of dossier, introducing yourself to them. I think for me, it's only helped improve my chances of getting follow-on funding from existing investors, and then funding from new investors, because I can say I have a clear regulatory pathway and I understand how this needs to go, and I've already engaged with them. So that sort of de-risks your risk. Another thing too, I don't know if anyone's heard or gotten pushback from people sort of saying, well, don't work with the FDA at all, and I think you'll hear that. Sometimes you might even hear that in spaces like this. And I think the most important thing is to be mindful of whoever you're partnering with, whether that's investors, whether that's team members, advisors, that they have an understanding that you can't just like ignore the FDA. If you even think you fall in a gray area, you should check it out to see, because ignoring it will lead you on a very slippery slope and end up costing you more money in the long run. and you're not even sure how to direct the company. Maybe it's that there were other solutions that you needed that, had you known and prepared beforehand, you could have addressed. It's difficult when you're in the market and you have deliverables and you are supposed to meet certain milestones to then have to backtrack. FDA is not quick, so you can't, like, I think when you submit your information, I think they give themselves 60 days, 30 or 60 days to
35 days.
35,
Round
right,
trip.
right, to grant a meeting, and so, which is pretty extraordinary given the amount of influx that they have in. And then whenever that meeting's granted, you have to maybe wait, like, 60 days or something, push that out to 60 days to have your meeting, and then to have follow-up minutes. So it's a slower process, so you want to get ahead of it as soon as possible. But it's very valuable. I've never had any interaction with the FDA where I felt it was not valuable in some sort of way. So, yeah, so interact early and often, and then view the FDA as a partner, not necessarily a foe. I think that's another thing too. They're trying to protect people and their health, and that's important because you are a person and you have health as well. So I'm grateful that they do monitor Zyrtec, which I have to take from time to time in the spring. So, for me, I'm happy that FDA monitors that and makes sure that there's no adverse side effects, or if there are, that they are clearly labeled. So if you keep that perspective instead of saying, oh, they're just trying to stop me from building my company, that's not true. They actually have several mechanisms that Elora talked about that are specifically for young companies. They will discount fees, so my registration fee is discounted because I'm technically a small business. So they do want and encourage innovation. It's just that they're not going to move at your pace. So keep that in mind. Yeah, and then I actually found out from an investor, he was an FDA, worked with the FDA for 12 years, and now he's turned into an investor. And I found out a couple weeks ago that de novo companies or de novo products are actually more likely to get acquired by larger companies than 510Ks, and then also from devices that don't have any sort of regulatory pathway at all. So that's another thing too, is that the pot at the end of the rainbow is that you have something that's valuable, to the point where you can think about, in the wearable space, Apple spent a considerable amount of time and energy and resources to get their EKG functionality of the Apple Watch approved. So there's reasons why you want to do it. It's not just to check a box or like an annoying regulatory box. It actually adds tremendous value to your company. So when you go out and fundraise or even think about getting acquired, you can say, listen, I'm worth way more than a regular wearable or whatever it is that you have, because I have FDA's approval and no one else in my space has that. So I think that's important. Those are my wrap-ups. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah.
Do you have a wrap-up?
Yeah, I think that was a great summary. So open to questions.
Yeah.
So when you say interact with the FDA, do you mean just go to their website and send them a FYI, I have an interest email, or give a telephone call and say, hey, I'm a new company? What do you mean by interact early?
So there's informal ways and there's formal ways. So there's like a hotline that you can call. So I actually called it right before I got into AbiliLife here, and I just wanted to confirm that I was going to be a Class 1 exempt device. So I called the hotline, and I forget what is the name of that? I always forget. It's not Dice. Is it Dice? It's Dice. There's a hotline that you can call. You can just say, you can ask them sort of very basic questions. You can't really go. So it's like you're getting like sort of the first line representative who could direct you to a website, but they don't really, you can't go into the science of your company. So if you have some questions about like where should I even talk, like I think I'm a device that needs regulation, but I don't know where to go. I am an orthotic, then they can direct you to where you need to go. And that's about it. And then from there, then I would sort of figure out, okay, who do I need to contact? So what we did was at that point, that's when I met Dr. Gupta, and so we actually put together like a dossier and pulled together all of my real world data from sort of beta testing, and made a dossier and submitted it to the branch chief, and that's the formal way that you go about requesting a meeting. And there's sort of like a process, a little bit antiquated, but it's a process that you go through that you have to submit like a physical hard copy to the FDA, and then they'll review it. But you can call DICE, and they can walk you through those like very basic mechanics. So that's what I would start with first.
Yeah, and like I said, it's not a DIY project, so, you know, can imagine, and, you know, there are many outside US companies working with the FDA as well. So DICE is great. There is, you know, very high level. There's also a place, if you go to the FDA, it's called CDRH Learn. And so there are a number of slides and webinars and kind of posted where you can educate yourself to know which path to go. And then, you know, there are many review divisions. So first you have to figure out who reviews it. And so that depends on your label. You know, what is it? So then how can it, and then you have to go back and search. And like I said, that's when you need some, you know, advice, and you need an advisor to kind of guide you through that. And once you've gone there a couple of times, then you kind of know what to do. But initially, and then like I said, you just don't want to go in randomly because you are being evaluated by the agency. So you want to start off on a very strong path. And DICE, and then I posted a guide, you know, I gave her the little snip from the guidance document. This is for Q-Sub meetings. This is mostly for devices. That also gives you a kind of detailed description of the procedural as well as what in general the content, but you know, it's like, it's very strategic. Any FDA document is strategic. It's about what should I do to support the label by doing the minimum number of studies. Essentially, that's what it is. And why is that appropriate? And it's all based on science, the technology, and then superimposing the regs. And so the writing style is a little different than what you would write, say, in a grant, versus how you write to an FDA. You know, so it has to overlay the regs, the precedents, and things like that. So again, like I would say that I would discourage anybody thinking that I can do it and save some, it could really hurt you in the long run.